Welcome back to the Deep Dive, you guys, where we love to, really get into some of the trickier parts of learning a new language.
Yeah.
And I'm Emily.
I'm excited to be here.
And
Hi, Emily.
Okay, so have you ever had this happen? You're like, trying to speak in a new language, you've put in the work, studied all the vocabulary, you've wrestled with the grammar, but it's like there's still this lag. It's like this feeling that like everything has to first go through like this filter of your native tongue before it can like come out. It's almost like your brain is like running two language tracks at the same time.
Yeah, it is. You know, it's kind of like a hallmark, I think, of the language learning journey, right? Like that, that split second where your mind is like, okay, I'm going to translate this and then try to like formulate, a coherent thought. I mean, it's something that pretty much every learner has to go through.
Yeah, exactly. And so today on the deep dive, we're going to be laser focused on, like cracking that code. So we've been digging into a really insightful conversation from the Language Mindset podcast. And they've got some really fascinating ideas on how to get beyond that constant internal translation and start actually thinking in your new language.
And what they bring out really well, I think, in the discussion is that, true fluency isn't just about stacking more vocabulary or like mastering difficult grammatical structures. It's really more fundamentally about rewiring your brain to connect concepts directly to the target language. You're basically trying to build a bypass around your native language's, automatic involvement.
It sounds like a big leap, doesn't it? I mean, it's almost like your brain needs like a software upgrade. But what's really encouraging is that, our sources, they don't just point out the challenge. They actually offer some really concrete, really actionable strategies that you can use, that you can start using today to try to make this shift.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. And I think our goal in this deep dive should be to kind of extract those practical techniques and really get a good grasp on how you as the listener can start to cultivate that direct connection with your target language and begin thinking in it, more and more naturally.
Okay, so let's get into the core issue here, this habit of translation. Why is it our brain's default setting when we're trying to learn a new language?
Well, I think a good way to think about it is this. Your brain is incredibly efficient. And when you encounter something new, it tries to relate it to what you already know.
Yeah.
So when you're learning a new language, the easiest, most immediate connection is going to be to your existing linguistic framework.
Yeah.
Your native language. You're basically trying to build a bridge from the familiar to the unfamiliar.
Right. Like the example they used, you see a chair, even if you know the Spanish word silla, your brain still might first flash the English word chair. It's like your native language is this, ever-present anchor.
Exactly. And while that anchor can be super helpful in the early stages, to grasp basic meaning, to start memorizing new words, it really does become an obstacle as you strive for that genuine fluency. Because that constant back and forth, it creates a bottleneck. And that bottleneck really slows down both your comprehension and your ability to just express yourself spontaneously.
So the real breakthrough comes when we can sort of cut that cord. When, seeing a chair immediately triggers that word without the English word chair even popping up, right?
Exactly. It's about forging a direct pathway between the concept chair and the Spanish word, independent of the English word chair.
All right, so how do we start laying down these new pathways? Well, the first strategy that they emphasized was this idea of intentionally naming objects around you in your target language. Can you tell us a little bit more about the power of this, seemingly simple act?
Yeah, I think this is kind of a foundational technique. And the beauty of it is it's immediate. The idea is to consciously observe the objects around you. Anything you can see, anything you can touch, anything you can interact with. And you want to make a deliberate effort to think of their names, but only in the target language. And in doing that, you're actively trying to bypass that English translation. And this is more than just, rote memorization or vocabulary building. You're actually trying to forge those direct mental links. You're cutting out the middleman of your native language.
So if you're sitting at their desk, you look at let's say your pen, right? And instead of thinking pen and then trying to recall the German word der Stift, you'd immediately look at it and think der Stift.
Yeah. Exactly. You're training your brain to directly associate.
Yeah.
You're taking that visual image and you're associating it directly with the word in the new language. And every repetition, it just strengthens that, that direct connection. And it's a very tangible way, I think, to just, to begin building that target language lexicon in your mind.
That makes perfect sense. It's like you're sort of reprogramming your brain's like internal dictionary. So what's the next step in this rewiring process?
Okay, so the next technique is something they call inner monologue practice. It might sound a little bit introspective, but it's a super effective way to kind of immerse your thoughts in that target language.
Inner monologue. So you mean just like thinking to yourself in the language that you're learning?
Yeah, that's right. So throughout the day, as you go about your normal routine, you want to try to narrate your actions, even your internal thoughts, in the target language.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be grammatically perfect. And you can start really, really small. Start with simple sentences, even just single words.
Okay. Can you give us like a practical example of how that might work?
Sure. So instead of thinking to yourself, oh, I should probably check my email now, you would consciously try to formulate that thought in, let's say, Italian. So you might think to yourself, dovrei controllare la mia email adesso.
Okay, I can see how that can really help with solidifying your everyday vocabulary and sentence structure. But what happens when you encounter a word or a phrase that you just don't know? I mean, that sounds like it could get pretty frustrating really fast.
That's a great point, actually. And it actually leads us really nicely into their next strategy, which is called circumlocution. This essentially becomes your go-to tool when that specific word escapes you.
Circumlocution. It sounds like some kind of strategic maneuver. What does it actually involve? In practice, I mean.
It's essentially, the art of describing. It's describing the object or concept that you want to express by using other words that you do know in the target language. So you're basically talking around the word using your existing vocabulary to kind of get the meaning across. It forces you to get a little bit creative and resourceful with what you know.
So like in their example, if you don't know the Korean word for refrigerator, you might try to describe it as the cold box where we keep food. All in Korean, of course.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And the real power here is that it forces you to stay within the boundaries of your target language. Instead of immediately reverting back to your native tongue to try to fill in that gap, the missing word, it forces you to think creatively and use your existing vocabulary. And this does two things. One, it obviously helps you communicate, but it also helps reinforce the words that you already know in new and different contexts. It's almost like a mental puzzle. You have to kind of solve it using the language itself.
That's actually a really clever way to stay immersed and keep the momentum going. So we've got naming objects, that internal running commentary, this really resourceful technique of circumlocution. What other approaches did they recommend for shifting our thinking?
Well, the fourth strategy is actually, it kind of broadens our focus a little bit. It's all about what they call contextual immersion. And this goes beyond just deliberate practice. It involves actively surrounding yourself with the target language in just the normal flow of your life, like in everyday life.
So like switching the language settings on your phone or on your computer. That's a pretty common piece of advice.
It is. And it's surprisingly effective, actually, because it forces you to interact with all those familiar interfaces, but you're having to do it in a new linguistic context. But contextual immersion also means things like watching movies and TV shows in the target language, listening to music, maybe podcasts, radio. The key here is consistent exposure to the language as it's naturally spoken, as it's used in real situations. The more you immerse yourself, the more your brain starts to just, become attuned to those rhythms and patterns.
So it's really about trying to create an environment where your brain is constantly processing the language, even when you're not actively studying.
Yeah, that's right. It's almost like absorbing the language through osmosis, right?
Yeah.
You're connecting words and phrases to all these visual cues in these real-world contexts without even having to really think about it.
Okay. That paints a pretty clear picture. And then there was this one strategy, this idea of thinking in pictures. And this one really, really stood out to me. I'd love to hear a little bit more about this.
Yeah, this is really interesting. This technique, it kind of taps into like a more fundamental level of understanding. So instead of going down that traditional route of mentally translating a word, like let's say cat, to gato in Spanish, right? You're trying to actively visualize a cat in your mind's eye, and then you just directly label that image with the Spanish word gato. You're basically bypassing the English word cat entirely.
So it's like a direct link from the visual concept to the target language word. You're skipping that linguistic middleman.
That's exactly right. And it's kind of cool. It actually mirrors the way that native speakers, especially kids, learn languages in the first place.
Right.
Because they learn to associate words directly with objects and concepts that are around them, in their environment. And they do that without the filter of another language, another established language system. And so it's actually a more direct path to both understanding and expression.
That's a really powerful connection. So it's like you're training your brain to kind of think conceptually in that new language instead of just performing this, this linguistic translation.
Yeah, precisely. And that allows you to develop, I think, a more intuitive understanding, like a less mediated understanding.
Okay, so let's quickly recap those 5 key strategies, so that we can solidify these in your mind as the listener. So we had intentionally naming objects around you, practicing that inner monologue in your target language, using circumlocution when you don't know the specific word, creating that consistent contextual immersion in your daily life, and then actively trying to think in pictures to make those direct links between concepts and vocabulary.
Yeah, those are all of the core strategies that they really went over in the discussion. And I think a really crucial point to remember here is that you have to be consistent. Like with any skill that involves like rewiring neural pathways, it's going to require a sustained effort, and it's going to take time.
And they did mention that, your brain, it might actually push back a little bit, because it's comfortable with those established habits of translation. At first, that's the path of least resistance.
Absolutely. Your brain loves efficiency, right? And, in the beginning, translation, that's going to seem like the easiest and most readily available and, efficient route to take. However, if you're persistent and you keep consciously applying these strategies, you're slowly going to build those new direct connections. And you'll find that, thinking in that target language, it just becomes more and more natural and it becomes more and more automatic.
So it's not about expecting to just wake up one day and be fluent. It's about consistently putting in the work. It's about making these small but consistent efforts to integrate those techniques into your routine.
Exactly. Every time you consciously choose to name an object, to narrate a thought, or to describe something, using your target language vocabulary, you're actively strengthening those connections, and you're moving closer to that goal of thinking in your new language.
This has been super, super helpful, it feels like, Now that we have these tangible steps, it makes this goal of thinking in a new language feel so much more achievable.
Yeah, I agree. It shifts the focus from just passively learning, to active engagement. These are techniques that I think really empower you, the learner, to take control of how your brain processes the language.
Absolutely. So for you listening right now, just take a moment to just consider your own journey, your language learning journey. Which of these strategies really resonates with you? Maybe start small. Start with something immediately actionable like they suggested. Maybe just try to name 5 objects, 5 objects around you in your target language right now.
Yeah, that's a great place to start. It's all about starting to make that shift. It's about building that momentum with those small, consistent actions.
And it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? If you're consciously making an effort to move away from translation toward this, direct association, how might that unlock, entirely new levels of understanding and connection, not just with the language itself, but also with the culture that it reflects?
Yeah, that's a really profound question, I think, because, when you start to think in a language, you're really starting to engage with all those inherent nuances, all those little subtleties. And those are the kinds of things that, translation often just filters out. So it can lead to a much, much deeper appreciation and a more authentic connection, I think, with the language in its cultural context.
Definitely gives us all a lot to think about as we continue on our language learning adventures. So which of these strategies feels like the most natural fit for you and why? Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today.
It's always my pleasure.
You're able to think in a completely different way.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
All right. We'll see you guys next time.
See you later.